You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 334 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump's immigration policy and how a recent court ruling is going to change how it's being implemented. We're going to discuss the Trump administration naming Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization, and then look at the war in Afghanistan, some recent stories, including 3 Americans being killed by the Taliban. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where you can find the show and my daily news roundup featured on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere if you like it. iTunes, Stitcher, BitChute, YouTube, whatever you like to use, the show should be there. I update current event stories on the show, so the way you're going to get the most out of it, understand all the little nuances I'm talking about with all these wars and conflicts going on around the world is by subscribing to the show. And if you really want to support the show, please donate on Patreon at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I had to talk about in today's show is the Trump immigration policy, and specifically this program or policy that Trump tried to start up here called the Remain in Mexico program, where if you were, I guess, an asylum seeker and you came to the border, essentially what they would do is they would give you a court date and say, okay, now you're going to wait on the Mexican side of the border for that court date, and then you could come into the United States to appear for your hearing. Now, they say that the reason for this, the excuse by the Trump administration, is because they give all these people court dates, but then they don't show up to court and just kind of live in the United States anyways. I guess that fear that you show up to your court date, you're not granted asylum, or you're not given whatever permission by the immigration court to stay in the United States, and they arrest you there and deport you, and that's that. And so it's a big gamble to show up to one of these court hearings, I suppose, and there's a chance it may make you a more legal resident of the United States, although there's still a lot of hoops and hurdles to go through, just post gain some temporary asylum or temporary residency or a visa or something like that. But, you can also get kicked out of the country if you show up to one of these things. So I guess it's not really surprising to me that a lot of people don't show up to the hearings. Also, I know that the immigration court system is really messed up, and the word justice, I don't really think it makes even sense to use. We shouldn't even pretend like, this is part of the criminal justice system. We've seen things happening, and not only in the Trump administration, but under the Obama administration, that I think if, we said that Iran or Russia was doing it, we would call them human rights abuses, and rightfully so, including, the detention of children has been especially horrific under Trump. They even had for a while the policy where they are intentionally separating the children from the families. Lots of, times they had court rulings but couldn't comply with the deadlines because their bookkeeping was so messed up and so disorganized. And so, a lot of the problem here is just on the human element portion of it. They didn't keep track of things well enough, that there's not enough judges hired to the court system. So, I've read reports of them doing mass trials where they'll have 10 people come in a hearing, and then, they'll sentence them. And, that's that. Also the problem that you could be sentenced to jail in the United States before being deported. The U.S. immigration policy and system is much uglier than I think most Americans realize. And, we just have this general idea that there's justice in the United States, and somebody going through immigration court is going to have just as much justice as, any other person in the United States accused of a crime. Which, I know most of you are libertarians, or if not, you're probably some kind of pretty far leftist, and you have some principles and understand that, the 95% of cases that don't even go to trial and end up in plea deals, and then when you actually go to trial, you have cases. I just watched that HBO documentary on Adnan Syed, where, I mean, just clearly shows how this young man was absolutely railroaded by the system, the prosecutors and the cops, and is a perfect example of how the, justice system isn't just. Now, there are some changes in the Department of Homeland Security, which kind of houses the umbrella of ICE and Border Patrol, and so I guess is responsible for a lot of this. Oh, briefly, just something I forgot to mention is that a lot of these immigration detention centers are apparently run by private companies that have pretty lucrative contracts with the government. So, this is, if the one real winner here certainly isn't the immigrants. In large cases, I don't think Americans are largely benefiting from the policy. If that may, not that it's like a great harm to anyone, but at the same time, it's not like every individual American is going to be able to point to them some way that, they're benefited by this policy. But boy, are, the people that are getting paychecks from the government to house all these immigrants are certainly raking in cash, and they carry out absolute abuses. I was just reading this story, and this is an immigration prison, but it's a different prison in Houston. I believe it's run by a private company, and some inmate is allergic to the blanket, and he starts getting sores on his body because he's allergic to it. And he's like, hey, I just need a cotton blanket. Can you give me a cotton blanket? He goes, to the medical ward for this and everything, asking cotton blanket. Finally, he has to take him to court. And guess what? It's 10 years later. And they're saying that, he doesn't even really have the right to seek any damages or anything like that. The only thing he's suing for in court right now is the cotton blanket. And it's not like when he brought the lawsuit, the, people at the top of the company who didn't realize this was going on, but the lawsuit brought it to their attention. And so they just said, give him a cotton blanket and hell, give him a nice mattress for his trouble. No, they continue to fight this thing even in court. Because, I guess for them, it would hurt them on the slightest of margins whenever you're talking about hundreds of thousands of inmates and giving them cotton blankets. And apparently the other ones that were used or made out of recycled material. There was a pretty good article, and it's an interview of Micah Zenko, who I think is a little bit more mainstream than kind of us libertarians. But he, has been good on a lot of these war issues, and I think reading back to like 2011 and 2012, he did some important work on the Brennan drone program in the Obama White House. But in this particular article, he's talking about how Americans are led to believe these false threats against them. And this is something I think I've talked about in the show in a lot more detail in the past, but he explains it a lot better than I do. So I'm going to link to his article in the show notes page. But if you think about it, from the position of America, especially before I was quote unquote woke, I was very afraid that, people are going to kill me. Nuclear weapons with Russia, the Chinese were going to invade. I remember my kind of grandfather's generation of people, hearing from them, oh, you shouldn't be learning Spanish. You should be learning Chinese because they're the ones that are going to take over the country. The terrorists, so the entire Muslim world, as well as North Korea. So many threats to Americans that, we need this massive defense budget and everything. And that's the pretext for so much of this stuff that we deal with is that, we have all these threats against us, so we must have a massive military. And then, the old Madeleine Albright position, well, we have this massive thing. We have to use it to show that we're willing to. And so, now you have to fight wars with this massive military that you've created. It's just kind of the most terrible of situations. And if you're a regular listener to the show, you'll know that every single one of these threats towards the United States is at the very least extremely inflated and a lot of times non-existent. That the only threat posed towards Americans is a reaction to American policy. And so if, let's say, there's ever an attack by a Yemeni person on the United States of America, it's going to be thought of from Americans as, we're not safe because of a threat in Yemen. And so then we have to go do things in Yemen to prevent attack against us. When in reality, the attack would have never occurred had the United States not been, supporting a dictator in Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, since right past post 9/11, helping him fight wars against his own people, carrying out drone strikes throughout the Obama administration. And then, since the end of the Obama administration, 2015 on, so the past 4 years now, equally the fall of Obama and Trump waging a war of genocide against that country. I mean, I was just reading from Daniel Larison at the American Conservative. He writes all the time there, and he's great, and everybody should be reading the American Conservative, but he really goes through and documents with, kind of evidence and tweets coming out of Yemen, this attack from the Saudi-led coalition, airstrike, killed 11 girls right outside of a girls' school. And so if you think of what the American mission is around the world, especially their role in the Muslim world with, maybe the primary thing is getting the terrorists, but secondary and the reason that we can never leave, etc., is because we had to protect the rights of women. Here you have a girls' school, and right outside of it you have an airstrike that kills 11 girls. It's unbelievable to think about how this kind of thing continues to happen and have so little opposition to it, but then never the realization later that, hey, those 11 girls had probably 22 parents, dozens, if not, 100 siblings between all of them, cousins, friends, certainly any kid that goes to the school won't forget this. I'm sure every single parent who has a child, at a school in Yemen right now hears about this and is terrified to send their kids to school, just like, the reaction of some American parents when there's a school shooting. And this, really has become daily. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of documented reports of Saudi strikes on Yemeni schools. You talk even about the sports stadiums, the roads, the bridges. They'll bomb anything. And so there's a real reason why the Yemeni parents would be afraid to send their children to school. And I think you're looking at a situation where millions, if not more, children are right now not going to school in Yemen because their school's been closed because bombings or teachers aren't being paid, or, parents are afraid to send them there. They're like, it's a little too dangerous. But, the threats aren't real. Wrapping back to the Zenko story. And if, I think importantly, one of the things I try to do on the show, I think one of the things that we could make progress on is just convincing the people around us of this too, is that Russia really isn't that much of a threat. They didn't hack our democracy. They're not, trying to gain the upper hand on America or anything like that, to plan an invasion against us. Certainly maybe they would look to have more regional influence or something like that. But, the perceived threats of all these countries are grossly inflated, to any extent that China is a threat to the U.S. at all, or North Korea is a threat to the U.S. at all. And, if we have policies of trying to get along with these countries rather than fighting combatively against them, then that threat would be little less or non-existent. That would be the way to reduce the threat. All right, now that I just stumbled through that, I need to move on to this IRGC terrorist organization thing. I think this is big and very concerning to me. Now, I think it was probably presented to Donald Trump as a way of sanctioning this organization, which they call a terrorist organization, because of the support of the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Palestine, and Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, and then kind of Assad too. Now, I think all these claims are pretty much bunk. The Houthis certainly aren't really terrorists. They're just a rebellion group in Yemen. And I still haven't seen any evidence of a Houthi suicide bombing. Now, that doesn't, mean that they're not a terrorist organization exactly. And it doesn't mean that I'm just unaware of these cases. But for as much as the Houthis are called terrorists, there's never any real evidence to back up that claim. And I think you have to, really make the case that they are a terrorist group. I think much more correctly to call them a rebellion group or an insurgency. But, there's definitely no, kind of global Islamic jihad there. And even if they do chant death to America, it's because America's bombing them. And, this is political rhetoric, not a serious policy of wanting to kill every single American. Hezbollah is a legitimate branch of the Lebanese government. And to think that in any way this could be considered a terrorist group is really odd to me. It shows just how little somebody would know about the Middle East to call this a terrorist group when it's really a state army at this point. It's a state political power in Lebanon. The Hezbollah role in Syria has largely been to beat back international jihadist groups like Syria, or with like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And so to label them against terrorist groups is ridiculous. The case against Hamas, I guess, would be the easiest one to make. And there's kind of, I believe in the second intifada, definitely some bombings and very clear terrorist acts. There was also the knife intifada where you had Palestinians just walking up to Israelis and stabbing them. So you did have acts that were certainly terrible, but to look in comparison and see the plight of the Palestinian the people and the injustices that they face, I think it's pretty obvious that this isn't like kind of an international jihad style or anything like that, but more or less just an insurgency, kind of saying that, hey, we're willing to fight for our land. And because you're backed by the world superpower, the United States, you have F-35s and tanks, the ability to, control the world economy, and, they have tons of weapons, and the Palestinians have nothing. And so I think there's maybe a reach of desperation over a terrorist group. And so to say the IRGC and Iran support terrorist organizations is a pretty thin critique, especially when you look at cases like Yemen and Hezbollah, where they are openly at war against the jihadist elements. And then from what I understand, especially the people of Gaza, and that would be where Hamas has control, are not very fond of the jihadist types and try to silence them when they do kind of enter their territory. Again, I think the kind of use that I've seen this being sold on, the reason for this label is to sanction this group to kind of cut off their ability to support these proxy groups. I don't know if that's going to work. I mean, every time I see something about Iranian sanctions, typically something's aimed at cutting Iranian ties from, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and I'm not sure, or trying to push them out of Iraq where they now have a lot of influence. So I'm not quite sure practically what kind of success that would have. Of course, there's another Daniel Larison, again, a great write-up by him in the American Conservative on how the U.S. policy and the Trump sanctions policy against Iran has been absolute failure. It seems like the Iranian economy has stabilized, even with the new Trump effort where they're, I believe, going to only give 5 people extensions on being able to import Iranian oil post May 4th. And that'll be Japan, Taiwan, China, India, and Turkey. And then I believe they're not extending those sanctions or those sanctions waivers, to Italy, Greece, and South Korea, who have now reduced their Iranian oil exports to zero. But even at this, Iran will be able to export about 1.1 million barrels of oil a day, and I think that's a pretty good number for them of exports. I think the other real issue here is through the interpretation of the 2001 AUMF, which is supposed to just be for the Afghan war, this seems to be enough legal justification to target Iranian IRGC members, especially if they're not in Iran. I don't think it's likely that the U.S. starts bombing, Iran proper, but if there's some kind of IRGC commander, let's say in Syria or Yemen, that might be an airstrike that the U.S. feels justified and legally authorized to take now. And so Congress better wake up and look at this situation and try to do something about it, because this could be a huge way to provoke war now for the Trump administration with Iran. And Congress will have been sitting on their hands the whole time. Again, this is gonna could be another one of those policies where suddenly Iran could be threatening U.S. troops. And I don't think there really ain't threat to Americans outside the Middle East, but you look at 14,000 troops in Afghanistan, 5,000 in Iraq, 2,000 in Syria, thousands that are, bases in other Middle Eastern countries, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. And so there are places for Iran to strike the U.S. in the region. And so, people will say, hey, how suddenly do we have the Iran threatening U.S. troops in the region as well? These steps that the Trump administration is taking now is critical to preventing any of this from happening. So Congress, wake up and please do something. Maybe Rand Paul will start holding up nominations or something like that. Now, a couple interesting things here is I heard this policy was being pushed by Mike Pompeo a few weeks ago, and I even talked about it on the show. and then downplayed it because I thought the proposal was just that preposterous, that there was no way that this was actually going to, happen. But it seems to be the case that, it's actually going through and happening. I think April 15th will be the official date that the IRGC becomes a terrorist organization. There is, kind of the issue definition here, just because this is a state organization again. And I believe, when Bill Clinton defined terrorist organization, it was a non-state actor. And I don't know how legally they're going to be able to puzzle through that. Or if it even really matters, they could just claim, no, this is what it meant. And then another interesting claim from that is Israeli President Bibi Netanyahu said that this was his policy that he pushed for. And so I guess I just want to say, first of all, that the elections are Tuesday, the 9th of April in Israel. So, if a politician says something a day before election, it might be made up. I think that's very possible. That he could just made it up to win the election, and then later on we'll find out that no, Trump says that this had nothing to do with his decision. But, this does seem to be something that Israel would be happy with. So even if it wasn't in this specific case, Netanyahu, who made this happen, he's certainly happy with the results. Another thing that Netanyahu said a couple days before the election is that if he wins re-election, he'll start annexing the West Bank. Will Porter pointed this out on the show, and there's a good article on it, that the Palestinian issue hasn't been a major focus of this election, but making this statement right before the election could make it a decisive issue in a small way here. That, if on the margin, Netanyahu just needs to win a little bit more of the right wing, this could be what pushes him over the edge and allows him to form a ruling coalition. Now remember, Israel's led by a prime minister, so even if we have election results in the next few days, there's coalitions to be built, and we may not actually know who the next prime minister of Israel will be for a few days or so. But if Netanyahu is serious and does plan to start annexing the West Bank after he wins re-election, this, would just be a terrible thing. But it would, I guess, be a confirmation that there's really no hope of kind of an independent Palestinian state. If you look at the map of where the Israeli settlements are in the West Bank, and understand that even if it's just limited to annexing those, the territory left doesn't make for a state. It's too fractured and chopped up, and honestly, most of the good pieces would be gone. All right, on to Afghanistan. 3 U.S. soldiers were killed near the Bagram Air Base by a Taliban car bomb. Guess some guy drove the car up there, killed three American servicemen, and then there were several others wounded. I'm not sure if, the death count figures to go up, or, hopefully all those injured will be able to be recovered. But at the same time, even if they're just injured, we're talking about car bombing here, so their lives are going to probably be pretty significantly altered by this event. And there are a lot more victims than just, these 3 Americans here. It's a reminder that now 20 Americans have died in the Afghanistan over the past 16 months. And none of it needs to be the case. When Trump took office, he could have shut this thing down. He could have brought the troops home the minute he became president, ordered them all home. Of course, as we've seen, there's going to be a lot of kind of the bureaucracy rebelling against it, but he could just fire people until somebody will actually do it. I'm sure he could find some, Douglas McGregor, Dub Bandow types to fill these positions to make it happen. That we end up bringing these troops home and no more Americans needlessly die in Afghanistan. Now, I'm sure there's better versus worse ways practically to leave the country, but at this point, it's just extra suffering and violence with the continued American presence in that country. Really, the only bright spot in Afghanistan is the fact that these peace talks are still going on between the U.S. and Taliban, and while they're happening far too slow, and as we see, Americans continue to die and Afghans continue to die because of this war. Maybe, in the not too distant future, we'll be wrapping things up a little bit. All right, the last thing I'll mention before I sign off is an article by Eric Margolis, and I want to recommend this for anybody who wants to understand what's going on in Algeria. Eric explains that he was a big supporter of the country's first revolution, which was, eventually corrupted and, end up with this dictatorial, quote unquote president of the country, and, some more kind of brutal type of ruling in the country over the years. But he kind of breaks down very briefly the past revolutions in the country and kind of gets into what could happen moving forward. And so if you want some kind of detail and context to help you understand the political instability in Algeria and the possible results, I'll have that linked in the show notes page. And thanks everybody for listening. I guess I should plug stuff again at the end. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, immersionnews.com, and libertarianinstitute.org.